Thank you so much for joining a Northside Church service online. We love to share the good news of Jesus, but would ask that you not use this as a substitute for getting involved with a church near you. No podcast or video can give you what you need in being connected to a local church. For more information about Northside, please visit northside-albany.com. We hope this encourages your soul.
Good morning. My name is Jamie. I'm one of the pastors here at Northside. Blessed to be able to spend this morning with you. It's an exciting day for me because, we are kind of at the very tail end of our series called Full and Free, which is sort of unpacking, what it is that Northside is really about. I feel like you guys deserve something because you made it all the way through there. So I'll try to think of something. Maybe we'll get ice cream sandwiches or something. I don't know. There's cupcakes over there, but maybe we'll have to divide them up and eat them. So anyway, I'm grateful that you guys stuck around and stuck through that. And again, when it really comes down to we're a brand new church just starting out, kind of understanding how we work and how we tick, I think is really, really important. And how to get plugged in, I think is really, really important. And we talked about this, the full and free, and that's really, our desire to see, people come to experience everything that God desires for them, the full and free life that God desires for every single one of us. And we talked about, kind of as we unpack that, there's three relationships that we really want to key in on. And it's our relationship with Christ, the relationship with His church, and the relationship with our community. There's a slide that will go with that, I think. And with that, with each of those areas, with each of those key relationships, there's kind of two things that kind of go along with it. So it's attending church and spiritual practices, it's serving teams and small groups, and serving and sharing. And so each one of those areas, our relationship with Christ, His church, and with our community kind of has two areas of focus that kind of go underneath those. And as we grow into experiencing what it means to be fully alive in Jesus, we have just found that those three relationships play an important part in our journey with God and growing into experiencing the full and free life that He has for us. And when we understand that becoming fully alive in Christ, right, it's not like you just all of a sudden arrive. It's like a direction. It's a journey. We move toward that in our relationship with Him, beginning to experience more and more and more the fullness and freedom that He has for us. At least that's been my experience. And so with that, sometimes the goal is to take a step back and to spend some time asking the question and praying into, God, what step would you have me take? What step would you have me take? Is He asking you to kind of make a dedicated commitment to spend more time in the Word? Or is He potentially calling you into a deeper prayer life? Is He asking you to jump into a small group because of just where you're at in your relationship with Him? Is He telling you, you really need to be involved with a service team at the church? And if that's the case, or any of those other things that we talked about, my plea would be, listen to what He's saying. If you want to experience all that God has for you, you're never going to get there by ignoring the prompts that God gives you in your heart. And so, listen to what He's saying and consider moving into those things. It really is good for us and for those around us. And really that kind of brings us into the last one, our relationship with our community, which is what we're going to talk about today. And it reminded me of a story that I heard a really long time ago. I wish I could remember who told it to me. It was a really long time ago, and it was about this newly appointed general who was appointed to a new post at a base in which he had never been. And so when he arrived that day, he was kind of getting a tour of the whole facility, and he ended up being able to meet all these other high-ranking officials and officers and stuff like that. He had a great day, and eventually he was shown the office where he would spend the majority of his time. And so, that day kind of came to an end, and the days that followed, he began to kind of set up shop and organize his office. When one particular morning, he was getting settled in behind his desk, and he looked up to see this young private walking across the yard toward his office, carrying a toolbox. And without much thought and wanting to make a really important, impression, he decided to pick up his phone quickly and hold it up against his head. And as the young man walked in, he said something to the effect of, "Yes, Mr. President, we're looking forward to dinner this weekend as well. Give your best to our wife, not our wife, your wife. Give our best to your wife, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you this weekend." And with that, he hung up the phone and kind of puffed up his chest and looked at the private that had just walked in the door, and he said something to the effect of, "And now how can I help you, young man?" To which the private kind of smiled shyly and held up the toolbox and said, "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm just here to hook up your phone." The commercial that you need to get away comes to my mind. How would you respond to something like that, I know. I don't know. I don't know how you would respond to that. I'm sorry. Just that would be an awkward moment for sure. But there are a handful of things that I think we can learn from that, to be honest, like serious things that we can learn from that. One is, knowing when looking at the opportunity for a career change. That could be one. I think sometimes, like learning this idea that anytime that we pretend to be something we're not, it hardly ever works out well. Anytime that we pretend to be something that we're not, it never works out well. And the other thing that I think is really important, especially with what we're talking about today, is coming to this understanding is that communication without connection never works. Communication without connection never works. And I think that's a really important truth. And I think there's some things for us to think about. And here's an honest question, something that I think it's good for us to wrestle with, but is this idea is what is our relationship as a church, or what is our relationship as people supposed to look like when it comes to the relationship that we have with the community that we live in? Does God have anything in mind for that? What is the relationship that we as a church, or we as people, supposed to have with our community? What is that supposed to look like, and does God have anything to say about that? And I started to think about that and pray into that, and I got to the point where it reminded me of a passage that's way back in the Old Testament in the book of Jeremiah. And in order for us to kind of understand that, I'm going to have to talk about quite a bit of history, otherwise it isn't going to make any sense. And so bear with me for that. But at this point in time, Israel was divided into two kingdoms, right? There was Israel in the north, there was Judah in the south. Basically kind of like a civil war, civil feuding, right? Two kingdoms, that's what's going on. And Judah had just watched Israel kind of be dealt with. Israel decided to turn its back and to rebel against God, and Israel was just dealt with by the Assyrian army, uprooted by the Assyrian army. Judah got to watch that, and it was a fate that Judah narrowly avoided. Literally, kind of in the final hour, Judah decided to listen to the prophet Isaiah and avoided the fate that Israel faced. And wouldn't it be great, right? Wouldn't it be great if we as people learn from our mistakes all the time, or better yet, even from the mistakes of the people around us? Wouldn't that be awesome if we could always do that? But it literally wasn't that much longer, and Judah found itself in the exact same position that Israel was in. They were rebelling against God. They chose idolatry over Him. The nation of Babylon was on the rise. They had laid waste to the Assyrians and to the Egyptians, and with them also the southern kingdom of Judah. And what they did was interesting. When they came into Judah, what they did was they took the smartest and the strongest and the most skilled people from Judah, and they shipped them off to Babylon. And can you imagine what it would have been like to be one that was left behind? And they were forced to live in exile there. And the truth is, if you read what happened to the people that were left in Judah, I mean, it's kind of gut-wrenching stuff. If you can imagine, the worst of living conditions, that's what they faced. They had the ones that they loved were kind of ripped away from them, and they were tortured, and some of them were even executed. And it says, if you read in the book of Jeremiah early on, it says that the food ran out. And so this was a group of people dealing with all of this stuff, and now they're starving, right? And so this is heavy stuff. Every time I read this kind of stuff or I study these kinds of things, it always amazes me how easily we forget to be thankful over the big things that, because of the culture we live in, we sometimes play off as small things. Judah was reminded in a very hard way just how important the big things are. And so they were. That's where they were. Many of their loved ones were shipped away. They were poor, tortured, starving. It was gone. Just like that. And one of the interesting things, as a side note, I find this stuff fascinating, and I hope that you do too, but one of the things, if you do any reading on this at all, what you'll learn is that even to this day, archaeologists are finding things in that part of the world in Judah, right now, actually, that help us to understand that this whole thing that we're reading about is not a fairy tale. This is not a story. Like just last year, 2019, toward the end of 2019, they uncovered some of these I don't know what you call them, artifacts now, that are Babylonian. That's how they got there. This really happened. And again, if you read, some of these people who aren't even believers in God are just constantly blown away at the reliability of what they see in the scripture when it comes to these kinds of things. And sure enough, Babylon, like many of the nation's powers that preceded them, world powers that preceded them, like with the rise of influence and the rise of power came the decline of morality. In fact, the decline of morality in Babylon became so severe that literally the term Babylon became synonymous with immorality. Like they would use that phraseology to like indicate immorality. One author said it like this: they had a crazy infatuation with self-centered indulgence. They were polluted by the grossest and most shameful lusts. And so in Judah, they were dealing with heartbreak, and literally they watched the Babylonians destroy everything: homes, families, palaces, even the temple. Right? The temple was destroyed to rubble, and the contents of the temple were taken out and hauled away to Babylon. And those who were in Judah actually did face a little bit kinder of a situation. Like they weren't in prison or they weren't even under house arrest. But if you can try to imagine what it would be like to live in a foreign country, you were uprooted from your own home to live in a foreign country, to walk the streets and come eye to eye every day with the people who did that to your countrymen, to your country, to the place where you met with God. Seems to me like there would be an element of them that would be feeling like, do we really belong here? Do we really belong here? And so in Babylon, there were several false prophets that rose up, and they began to tell people everything that they wanted to hear. One of them was a guy named Hananiah. And Hananiah actually came and told the people of Judah, said, hey, you know what? Within 2 years, this is what's going to happen. God's going to save you. And he's going to bring you all back to Jerusalem. And everything that was taken from the temple was going to come back, and it was a lie. And in Jeremiah 28, you can read about this. Eventually Jeremiah dealt with Hananiah, confronted Hananiah, Jeremiah 28:15. And he basically said, Hananiah, you need to remember that you were not sent by God, that you're lying to these people, and for some reason these people are believing you. And Hananiah paid for the lies that he told in a pretty severe way. He ended up losing his life over it, actually. And so after all this happened and people watched kind of the false prophets rise and lie to them and be dealt with, this is actually what Jeremiah spoke to the people in Babylon that were hauled away. This is what it says. Jeremiah 29:4-7. This is what the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of Israel, says to the captives that he has exiled to Babylon from Jerusalem. Imagine what it must have been like to hear Jeremiah speak these words. Build homes, plan to stay, plant gardens, and eat the food that they produce. Marry and have children, and then find spouses for them, so that you may have grandchildren. Multiply, do not dwindle away. And work for the peace and the prosperity of the city that I sent you into exile. And pray to the Lord for it, for its welfare will determine your welfare. And can you imagine what Jeremiah's words must have sounded like? It's hard for me to wrap my head around after everything that happened to your people, your homes, your church. And, you got to understand that they were living among a people whose very name basically meant immorality. And the truth is, maybe we don't like to admit it, I don't know. But the truth is, I actually think we have some things in common with those folks that were stuck in Babylon. It's not my favorite thing to talk about, but I do believe that we live in a culture that struggles with morality. And just like every world power that's preceded us, becoming more and more complacent, losing sight of what we really need. Sometimes even getting to the point where we feel like we really don't need anything. We're pretty self-sufficient. And I hope and pray that there is not a day where we wake up sometime and realize just how important the big things are. It reminds me of something else that very similar to what we read in Jeremiah. It's in 1 Peter chapter 2, 11 and 12. And this is what it says. Dear friends, I warn you as a temporary resident and foreigners to keep away from worldly desires that wage war against your soul. Be careful to live properly among your unbelieving neighbors. Then even if they accuse you of doing wrong, They will see your honorable behavior, and they will give honor to God when he judges the world. And so what Peter is telling us, like as Christians, as believers in God, that we are foreigners here. Peter was reminding us that our home is heaven and that we are created to be with God and in God's presence. And just like Jeremiah, I feel like Peter is telling us to live with intentionality and to live with purpose in our everyday life. Peter reminds us not to get into this culture. Don't get sucked in by this culture and the worldly desires that wage war against our very souls. These life-giving things that we've been talking about on Sunday morning. Things like hate and greed and gossip and lust and self-centeredness. These things that are life-taking things. But instead, Peter says, live with such intentionality that even if they mistreat you or even if they unfairly accuse you, that they will clearly see Jesus in us to the point where they will honor God themselves. They'll end up acknowledging and honoring him themselves. So here's this group of people from the southern kingdom of Judah. They've been living in exile with some freedom, even though I guarantee you they didn't feel free. And they hear this prophet tell them, not just, the goal here is not simply to tolerate this, but he's saying, pray for them, invest in it, and work toward the health and the welfare of the city. Work toward the health and the welfare of the city. I don't know if you caught what Jeremiah told them in verse 7. I actually think it's a pretty big deal because it would be easy for the people of Judah to think that this is something that the Babylonians may have done to them. Did you catch what God actually said? To the city in which I have sent you. They were sent by God. Into the moral armpit of the world at that time. To pray for and impact the culture by living intentional. By living intentional. There's another author I read as I was preparing for this morning, and this is how he phrased it. What if God's way, or one of God's ways of reaching a city is as simple as this? What if God's way of reaching a city has to do with his people simply living intentional as they go about their life? The comings and goings of their life, I think is how he said it. What if God's way of reaching a city came down to his people living intentionally in the comings and goings of their life? One of my favorite passages in Scripture is Matthew 5-7. It's called the Sermon on the Mount. It's Jesus preaching. You're not going to beat that, right? And so it's super good stuff. And early on in chapter 5, one of the things that Jesus tells the people that were with him that day is he tells them to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. And I do think that that's some of what Jeremiah and Peter are talking about. That as they set up in a culture, as they set up shop in a culture that's far from God, that they'll play the role that salt and light play, that they'll give off the flavor of God's love and grace, that they'll preserve his truth, and that they'll show people the way to Jesus by the way that they live and by the way that they treat others and care for others. And I believe that's true for us today, that God calls us to impact our culture not by winning arguments, but by living intentionally. By putting a good word for Jesus with our actions and our attitudes and watching for opportunities to speak his love and grace, the same love and grace that he's given us in our natural comings and goings of life. It reminds me of what we read in another one of my favorite passages in Scriptures. I have a lot. 2 Corinthians 5:17-20. It's powerful stuff. This is what it says. This means that anyone who belongs to Christ has become a new person. The old is gone and the new life has begun. And all of this is a gift from God who brought us back to himself through Jesus, through Christ, and God has given us the task of reconciling people to him. God has given us the task of reconciling people to him. For God was in Christ, reconciling the world to himself, no longer counting people's sins against them. And he gave us this wonderful message of reconciliation. So we are Christ's ambassadors, and God is making his very appeal through us. We speak for Christ when we plead, come back to God. We are a sent people. We are a sent people, sent by God. We are his representation, his hands and feet to the world around us, making God's appeal for him, which is what? Come home. Come home. God told them through Jeremiah to build homes and to plant gardens, to go to work, to pray for the peace and the health and the welfare of the city, to invest in the peace and health and the welfare of the city where God had planted them. And so my question for us today and in this place and in this time is like, what does that look like for us? Do we even care? What does that look like for us? And to be honest, I'm not really interested in attending a church that's not committed to this. Sorry, that's hard. I'm really not. And I'm certainly not interested in leading a church that's not committed to this. I really believe that we are a sent people by God to care for and invest in and work with and work toward the health and the peace of the city, the great city that God has put us in. And just like the story that I told earlier, there's an important truth. The communication without connection just doesn't work. So if we want to be sure that we're not anymore, than a general talking on a phone that doesn't work, we will have to be connected to the culture and to the city that we live in. God didn't call Judah to simply endure it. He's not calling us to simply exist either. And as you can imagine, being a brand new church, we literally are praying right now, often, that God would reveal what that looks like for Northside. And I want to invite you to pray with us into that, because the truth is, I still don't feel like we've been given clear direction here. And here's specifically, I guess, what I ask you to do is to begin praying about that. And if you ever sense anything, you can either come, email the office at northside-albany.com, or even on the back of a communication card, connection card today, if you have an idea, write it down and just turn it in, because I'd love to hear from you. But here's the thought process that's going on in my head is what are the needs? I'm not talking about I'm trying to think of something silly. There's something silly that needs done. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about what are the needs that Albany really has? Really has. Where are the hurt? Where's the hurt? Really, where is it? Where are the needs in our city? And if something jumps out to you, or you pray and you feel like God is leading in something, write it down and let us know. I really love to hear from you. But my hope is that we will be able to step in as his hands and feet, not with judgment, with an open heart, an open mind, to care well for the people where God has sent us. And I hope it resonates in us. I hope that we feel the responsibility, the passion, and the compassion that Jesus felt, and it left that example for us when he was here, to love well, to serve well, to care deeply for those that were different, hurting, lost, and alone. By God's grace, I hope we will care too, and I hope that we will invest as well. I always say this when I talk about serving, because I believe it's true and it's hard. But by its very nature, serving is supposed to cost you. It will cost you. It's supposed to cost you. Serving is coming to this place where we give of ourselves in order to speak into and care for people well. Does that make sense? It's supposed to cost us. It involves sacrifice for the good of others. When it comes to this idea of sharing with others, I showed this clip at church maybe 8 years ago. It's one of the best clips that I've come across when it comes to this, and so I hope you'll enjoy it.
And it was really wonderful. I believe he knew that I was an atheist. But he was not defensive, and he looked me right in the eyes. And he was truly complimentary. It wasn't in any way, it didn't seem like empty flattery. He was really kind and nice and sane, and looked me in the eyes and talked to me, and then gave me this Bible. And I've always said, that I don't respect people who don't proselytize. I don't respect that at all. If you believe that there's a heaven and hell, and people could be going to hell or not getting eternal life or whatever, and you think that well, it's not really worth telling them this because it would make it socially awkward. And atheists who think that people should proselytize, just leave me alone, keep your religion to yourself. How much do you have to hate somebody to not proselytize? How much do you have to hate somebody to believe that everlasting life is possible and not tell them that? I mean, if I believed, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that a truck was coming at you and you didn't believe it, that truck was bearing down on you, there's a certain point where I tackle you. And this is more important than that. And I've always thought that, and I've written about that, and I've thought of it conceptually. This guy was a really good guy. He was polite and honest and sane, and he cared enough about me to proselytize and give me a Bible, which had written in it a little note to me, not very personal, but just, like to show and so on. And then like 5 phone numbers for him and an email address if I wanted to get in touch. Now,
do you guys know who that is by chance? Yeah. That's Penn Jillette, I think, right? From Penn and Teller. I don't know if they're magicians or comedy, probably a little of both, right? And they used to do a show, I think they still do a show, and after the show, he would often go home and kind of talk about what happened that night, and kind of the backstory is that as the show ended that night, there was a guy waiting for him outside with a Bible, and walked up and handed him, you can kind of, he's an atheist, he's actually one of the most renowned atheists in America, right? And this guy had a Bible, and you can tell that it messed with him, right? As this guy walked up and kindly just said, hey, this is who I am. I'm a businessman. I'm not a crazy person. Like, I just wanted to give you this Bible. And like he's wrestling with this. You can see he's wrestling with this. What does it mean? There's things that this atheist, Penn is an atheist, and there's things that this atheist gets that I think a lot of people don't get. Like, he's actually, if he finds out that you're a Christian and you never say a word, he's actually offended by this. And I love the example that he gives. He's like, hey, if I tell you there's a truck barreling down on you and you don't believe me, like, at some point it's getting physical. Like, I'm going to take you to the ground. I'm going to tackle you. I'm not going to sit here and watch your destruction unfold before my eyes, is basically what he's saying. And sometimes as Christians, I come to this point and I kind of ask this similar question. It's like, if we really believe, like he is saying, that God is who he says he is, and that forgiveness is a real thing, and that eternal life with God is a real thing, how do we just walk past that and not say anything? Now, I would tell you, I really feel like that's a harsh example. I really do. I've been in ministry for a long time, and I will be the first to tell you, I still struggle with this. Flat out, I do. It's hard for me. This is outside of my comfort zone. It always has been, even when I was doing youth ministry. It's a little easier when you're dealing with people that are now much younger than you. But it's when it's peers, it is uncomfortable, and it is hard. And I want you to know that I think it's okay that it's hard. But I do think there's something for us to wrestle with here. And I want you to know that I don't think the answer is found in bumper stickers or t-shirts or blowhorns. I don't think that's actually all that helpful. The Bible is full of passages that talk about being patient and kind and not trying to win or start arguments. Instead, I think what we should do is follow Jesus' example. And what you see in Jesus' example is over and over and over and over and over again, he got involved, right? He sat with a woman at the well. He touched the leper. He ate with outcasts. He was motivated by true love and grace and the deep desire for people to experience everything that God had for them. And it's easy to feel underqualified. It's easy to come to this place where you say, you know what, I don't know enough. But I want you to know, I just don't believe that. There are a lot of resources that are out there that can be helpful. And to be honest, I think the resources, what they really are for, is to help us understand what living intentional might look like. And because I'm kind of a simple guy, I always look for the simple ones. The one I'm about to share with you, super hokey. Sorry, just is. And it's called prayer, care, and share. That's it. They rhyme. You can remember it, prayer, care, and share. But the basic idea behind prayer is asking the question, who are you praying for by name that might be, living outside of what it is that God has for them? And one of the things I'm just going to tell you, if you want to learn to live intentionally, learning how to pray for people who aren't living in a relationship with Jesus every day is one of the largest steps that you can take toward intentionality that I've ever found. I wish I had time to tell you stories about that. One of them is my wife and her sister. But praying intentionally every day for people who are living outside of everything that God has for them It's really important. Care is exactly what it sounds like. Care is, like being a good neighbor is the way I'll say it, right? It means like being involved, inviting them over, inviting them into your world, and those kinds of things. Like if they need help, giving a helping hand. Now, here's the important part with care. I struggled with this when I was a new Christian many years ago. It's not manipulative. We don't care because we hope that we get something out of it. Like, don't make that mistake, please, because it's not helpful. When we care, it's not because we hope that sometime down the road we're going to get something out of it. We care because people are worth caring for. And that's the end of it. We care just like Jesus cared for us, right? No strings attached. Because he loves us. We care because people are worth caring for. And then the share aspect is looking for opportunities to share the love and hope and grace that we have experienced in Jesus with them in the everyday coming and goings of life. Again, like I understand it's hard, sometimes it's overwhelming, but I want to share with you the most powerful testimony I've ever heard. It's one of the most powerful testimonies I've ever heard. There was this guy that was born blind, been blind all of his life. In fact, it was such a hindrance that his life was kind of reduced to being a beggar. And somewhere along the line, he ran into Jesus, and Jesus healed him. And you can imagine that this kind of caused like a stir. People were like, okay, what's going on with this? This is weird. And people started asking questions. In fact, the religious leaders of that day didn't know what to think of it either. And so they called this guy in and they said, what's going on with this? And they didn't like his answer. So they called his parents in. And his parents were worried that if they answered that they would be kicked out of the church. And so they basically said, he's old enough, go deal with him. And so second time, the religious leaders brought this guy in. And you can actually read about it in the Gospel of John. It's John 9:24 through 25. This is what it says. They called the man back a second time, the man who had been blind, and told him, give credit to God. We know this man is an imposter. This man that they're talking about is Jesus. They're saying, give credit to God, but we know this man Jesus is an imposter. And this is how the blind man replied that now can see. He said, I know nothing about that one way or the other, but this is what I do know. I know this one thing for sure. I was blind, but now I see. And everybody who heard that man on that day had to wrestle with the reality because they knew this guy as the beggar that stood at the gate and that he was actually blind. And now he can see. And I love this because this guy wasn't a theologian. He wasn't like even a respected or wealthy man. He was a beggar. And when the opportunity came for him to speak into the reality of who Jesus is, he simply told him what he knew. I once was blind, but now I see. And there wasn't a single person in the room that could argue. When it comes to this idea of sharing our faith, like sometimes we think it's this big social awkward event. It doesn't have to be. Sometimes it's just going through life and looking for those opportunities and open doors that I really do believe that God puts on our path to speak in a good word for Jesus and what we know about him. You don't have to be a theologian. You don't have to have it all together. You can simply say this, look, this is what I know. I'm a work in progress to this day. But I once was blind and now I see. To be open, to be honest, and a little bit brave. One of the resources that we have for you guys, if you want to use it, is on that back table on your way out, but also at the welcome table on the way out the main door. There's these little invite cards, and like that's something that we do just if you have friends that you want to just say, hey, would you come to church with me? It's like the size of a business card, so you can put it in your wallet or in your purse or whatever, and just hand it to people and say, hey, we'd love to sit with you. That's one thing that you can do. But Northside will be a church that is connected to and serving our community, and my hope and my prayer is that you'll join us. I hope and pray that we'll be a group of people that care enough about our community to share what we found in Jesus, the love and grace that we found in him. To be honest, I think what we're talking about today is often the difference between a healthy church and a church that's simply going through the motions. I wonder what it would be like if we made the commitment to pray for the city we live in every day. I wonder what it would be like if we began to pray purposefully for our neighbors every day. Ask God to show us what it is that we can do to care for them. I want you to know that I really believe that that's part of what it means to follow Jesus. That's actually part of what it means to follow Jesus. Would you pray? God, when it comes to the great city you put us in, I pray that you would teach us what it means to love well, to care well. God, that when we go into your word and then we pray into your word, God, that you would remind us again and again and again of your example to get involved. God, we're so grateful for the way that you love us, and I pray that that kind of love and grace and relationship doesn't end with us, but God, that you would help us to understand what it means to be your representation, your hands and feet in the community in which you put us. And God, I pray that you would break our hearts with the things that break yours. We pray that in Jesus' name. Amen.